The 7th floor of Boston's Harrington Medical Center did not belong to the hospital. Everyone on staff knew it, the way you know something without anyone ever saying it out loud. The elevator buttons for 7 were always clean. No fingerprints, no smudges, because nobody pressed them by accident twice. The floor existed on the building directory between oncology and radiology, listed simply as private suite management, which meant nothing and was meant to mean nothing. What it actually meant was that someone very powerful had paid a very large sum of money to ensure that whatever happened on that floor stayed there. Wren Calloway had worked the NICU on 6 for 3 years before she ever set foot on 7. She was 29, which felt both too young and too old for everything she'd seen, too young to be as tired as she was, too old to be surprised by anything anymore, or so she'd thought. She was the kind of nurse that other nurses called dependable, which was the professional word for the thing that meant. She stayed late, she double-checked, she noticed. Not brilliant, not flashy, just meticulous in the way that quiet people sometimes are, the way that gets you through nursing school on scholarships and gets you a commendation from administration and gets you, ultimately, nowhere that anybody else wants to be at 3 in the morning. She had a half-eaten granola bar in her scrub pocket and a ponytail that had stopped being neat around midnight when she got the call about room 713. The patient's name on the intake chart was listed as Arlo weeks old, premature by 9 weeks, currently presenting with failure to thrive. Weight at admission, 4 pounds, 2 ounces. Weight at 48-hour check, 4 pounds, 0 ounces. Slight decrease, the attending had noted. Within expected range post-admission, monitoring continued. Wren had read that note 3 times standing in the elevator. Within expected range. She'd been doing this long enough to know that within expected range was the thing you wrote when you didn't have an answer yet and needed to buy time. It wasn't wrong, technically. A 2-ounce drop in 48 hours wasn't unusual in a premature infant adjusting to enteral feeding, except she'd also read the notes from the 48 hours before that, and the 48 before that. Arlo Fee had been losing weight for 11 days. Not dramatically, not in any single measurement that would set off alarms. Just steadily, quietly. 2 ounces here, an ounce there, holding briefly, then sliding again. The kind of loss that looked like normal variance if you only looked at any one data point. The kind that only became visible as a pattern if you read every single chart note in sequence, which nobody had done, because the attending changed every 4 days on this floor, and each one had read only their own segment, and found it unremarkable. Wren had read all of them in the break room at 11:15 with cold coffee and a feeling in her chest she didn't have a clinical word for. Room 714 was different from the other rooms on 7 in ways that were immediately obvious and ways that weren't. Obviously. 2 men in dark suits stood outside the door in the corridor, neither of them looking like hospital staff, both of them looking at Wren the way you look at something you're already calculating the weight of. The less obvious difference was the monitoring equipment, newer than what Harrington typically ran, installed alongside rather than replacing the hospital's own systems. Someone had brought in their own. She told the men she was the charge nurse assigned to the pediatric patient in 714. One of them, broad, with a jaw like a shelf and a wireless earpiece that he didn't try to hide, looked at something on his phone and then nodded at the door. The other didn't move, just watched her badge, her hands, the granola bar wrapper just visible at the top of her pocket. She went in. The room was dim. A lamp on the far table gave everything a warm amber tone that didn't belong in a hospital. The machines were quiet. Not alarming, just measuring, the soft, persistent rhythm of monitoring equipment doing its job. In the isolette near the window, very small, in the particular stillness of newborn sleep was Arlo. The man sitting in the chair beside the isolette was not sleeping. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at the baby with an expression that Wren couldn't immediately categorize and that she spent the rest of the night thinking about. Not grief, exactly. Not fear, though fear was in there somewhere. Something more like vigilance, The specific alertness of someone who has decided they are not going to look away. He was maybe 35, dark-suited like his men outside, but wearing it differently, the jacket open, tie loosened, the kind of man who dressed expensively out of habit rather than vanity. There were tattoos on the back of his right hand. He didn't look up when she came in. "You're not the same one who was here at 9, he said. "No," Wren said. "I'm the charge nurse for tonight's shift. I came to check on Arlo." He looked up then. His eyes were dark and very still, and they did the same thing the man outside had done, moved across her in a single assessing sweep that was not hostile and not warm, and was somehow more unsettling than either. "Check on him," he repeated. Not a question, not agreement, just the words, held up to the light. "His weight trend over the past 11 days, Wren said, because she had decided in the elevator that she was going to say it, is not within expected range. The notes say it is. I think the notes are wrong." The room was very quiet. "Go on," the man said. His name, she learned over the next 40 minutes, was Stellan Varro. He did not elaborate on what he did, and she did not ask, partly because the men outside the door had made certain things self-evident, and partly because it didn't matter to her right now. What mattered was Arlo, who was Stellan Varro's son, who had been born at 31 weeks to a mother who had died 12 days ago in a car accident on Route 1, and who had been losing weight every day since admission in the quiet, persistent way that things sometimes decline when nobody is looking closely enough. Stellan listened to everything she said without interrupting her. This was unusual. In Wren's experience, powerful men interrupted nurses. They thanked you for your concern and explained that the specialists had already reviewed the case. They used words like protocol and team assessment to mean that the conversation was over. Stellan Varro sat in the amber light next to his 11-day-old son and listened to every word. Wren said as though it were the most important thing he had heard all year. "What do you think it is?" he said when she finished. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's what I need to find out." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite relief, more like recognition, the specific look of someone who has been waiting without knowing they were waiting for a particular kind of answer. "Then find out," he said. The day shift attending was Dr. Fenwick. He was 61, grey-haired, the kind of physician who had been doing this long enough that competence had calcified into certainty, which was not the same thing. He had overseen Arlo's care for the past 4 days, and he was not pleased to find Wren in the nursing station at 7 in the morning cross-referencing, feeding logs against intake weights with a printed spreadsheet she'd made herself. "Miss Calloway," he said. The miss was deliberate. She was almost 30, held a BSN plus 2 years of postgraduate certification, and had worked this unit longer than he had. He said miss the way some men said it to remind you of something. "Dr. Fenwick," she said, "I've been looking at Arlo Varro's weight trajectory. I'm aware of the patient's chart. He's lost 11 ounces in 11 days. That's a consistent daily average of 1 ounce per day. It's not random variation. It's a pattern." Fenwick set down his coffee cup with the particular precision of a man choosing his patients carefully. "The infant is 9 weeks premature and recently experienced the death of his primary caregiver. Some adaptation period is to be expected. Adaptation doesn't typically produce this kind of linear loss. I'd like to request a review of his TPN formulation. I think there may be a preparation error, possibly in the amino acid concentration." Fenwick looked at her the way men sometimes look at you when they've already decided the answer is no, and are just waiting for you to finish so they can say it. "The TPN is compounded by pharmacy according to standard neonatal protocol. The formula has been reviewed. By whom?" He picked his coffee cup back up. "By me." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable. "I'd like to see the pharmacy records, the original compounding orders and the preparation logs. Miss Calloway." Now his voice had the thing in it, not quite a threat, just the particular temperature of authority that expects to settle things. "This floor operates under a specialized administration arrangement. The patient's family has certain expectations regarding privacy and discretion. What I need from the nursing staff is careful, attentive care. What I do not need is someone generating additional paperwork and alarm based on a spreadsheet made on a legal pad. She went back to her spreadsheet, but she also put in a request to the pharmacy department for records. Routine care coordination, she wrote in the reason field. Pre-shift continuity review. It was not exactly a lie. The records came back at noon. She read them in the break room on her lunch break with her phone face down on the table, and the kind of very specific attention she usually reserved for things that scared her. The TPN orders were correct. The formula was appropriate for Arlo's gestational age and weight. The compounding logs showed the right volumes, the right concentrations, signed off at the right times. But there was a discrepancy. The preparation timestamps showed that Arlo's bags had been compounded in 2 separate batches over the past 11 days. The first on admission, the second beginning 6 days ago when the original batch ran out. The formula was the same on paper. The outcomes, according to her weight chart, were not. In the first batch period, Arlo had held weight with minor fluctuation. In the second batch period, the linear loss had begun. Same formula. Different pharmacist. She looked up the name on the second set of compounding logs, J. Harwick, Pharm D. Dr. Jerome Harwick was not difficult to find. What was difficult was figuring out what to do about what she was finding. She spent 2 hours that afternoon building the case quietly, the way you build something when you know you're going to need it to stand up to people who don't want it to stand. She reviewed the second batch's preparation records against standard compounding protocol for neonatal TPN and found 3 anomalies, small, individually explainable, collectively troubling. An osmolarity calculation that ran slightly outside the accepted range. A lipid concentration noted as adjusted for clinical discretion, which was not standard language. A handwritten correction on one of the printed order forms that had been initialed but not countersigned. Each one on its own was a paperwork irregularity. Together they made her stomach feel like it was full of cold water. She brought it to the charge pharmacist at 4. He looked at the documents she'd assembled, looked at her, and told her he would flag it for review. His voice had the texture of a man who is going to do exactly nothing. She went back to room 714 at 6, when the evening settled over the floor and the corridor was quiet and the men outside the door had rotated to a new shift. Stellan was there again. She was starting to understand that he was always there, that the chair he occupied had become, in 11 days, a kind of permanent position, the way certain people hold certain ground. "I need to ask you something," she said. He looked at her. "Is there anyone associated with Arlo's care, or with your organization, who would benefit from Arlo not recovering?" The quiet that followed was not the quiet of shock. It was the quiet of a man cataloguing something he already suspected. "Why?" he said. Flat, careful, she laid out what she'd found. The batch discrepancy, the anomalies in the compounding records, the weight trajectory correlated precisely with the second batch period. She did not editorialize. She just showed him the numbers the way she'd arranged them, the same way she'd laid them out for herself at midnight, factually, sequentially, without a gap. When she finished, Stellan Varro stood up. He was tall in a way that the chair had minimized. Standing in this small room, he was something else. Not threatening toward her. She didn't feel that, but radiating a controlled energy that made the ambient air seem to vibrate at a slightly different frequency. He walked to the window, looked out at the city lights below, and was quiet for 60 seconds in the way that people are quiet when they're not resting but working. "His name," Stellan said without turning around, "is Harwick. You know him. I know of him." He turned. "Jerome Harwick lost his contract with my operation 8 months ago, a supply chain dispute. He has been petitioning for reinstatement since then." A pause. Through intermediaries, something cold moved through her. "He's on staff here. I didn't place him here." His jaw was tight. "Someone else arranged that." The silence between them had a different quality now, not empty but full, loaded with the specific weight of something that had just been confirmed. "I need to pull the current bags," Wren said. "Tonight. If the formulation has been altered, he needs to go back to the first batch protocol immediately. And I need to have the bags tested independently. not through the hospital's internal system. Stellan looked at her with the same expression he'd had when she'd told him she needed to find out what was wrong with his son. Except this time there was something else in it. "You understand what you're stepping into," he said. It wasn't a warning. It was an honest question, the kind that some people ask when they actually want to know the answer. She thought about Arlo in the isolette. 4 pounds and decreasing. 11 days of something nobody had caught. "I understand what I'm stepping out of," she said, "which is being the person who knew and didn't act." She pulled the bags at 8:15. She told the night supervisor she was performing a routine bag swap per new physician's orders. Technically a lie. Technically a thing she could lose her license over. Technically the only option she had given that the physician who would have needed to issue those orders was Dr. Fenwick, who had already demonstrated the precise shape of his interest in her findings. She logged it as she would any bag swap. She tagged the pulled bags for independent analysis and secured them in a transport case that Stellan had arranged via one of his men, without her having to explain what she needed it for or why. Then she went to the pharmacy's secondary compounding lab on the 2nd floor. It was 9:45. The lab was empty, which it was on most evening shifts. The lights came on automatically when she pushed through the door, the fluorescent flicker of a room designed for function rather than comfort. She wasn't entirely sure what she was looking for. More documentation, she told herself. Something to corroborate what she'd already found. Something concrete enough that the charge pharmacist couldn't call it a paperwork irregularity and file it in a drawer somewhere. She found more than that. On the back counter, behind a rolling cart stacked with empty IV bags, there was a secondary log, handwritten, separate from the digital records she'd been given. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. Then it took her another moment to understand what it meant. It was a formulation variance log, every deliberate deviation from standard protocol, with dates and batch numbers. The kind of record that shouldn't exist, because deliberate variance from standard neonatal TPN protocol, without a physician's order, didn't exist in a functioning pharmacy, or wasn't supposed to. The dates matched the second batch period exactly. The initials at the bottom of each entry were JH. Her hands were steadier than she expected. She photographed each page with her phone methodically, starting at the top left corner of each sheet, the way she'd learned in her undergraduate evidence course, a pre-nursing elective she'd taken because her roommate had talked her into it. That documentation was more powerful than memory and more defensible than description. She was on the 4th page when the lab door opened. Dr. Jerome Harwick was not a large man. He was slight in his late 50s, with the particular neatness of someone who keeps himself orderly as a professional habit. He looked, when he came through the door, like someone who had been told something was happening in the lab and had come to confirm it. He looked at Wren. He looked at the log on the counter. He looked at her phone. "Miss Calloway," he said. She was already calculating. Distance to the door, 12 feet behind him. Distance to the secondary exit at the back of the lab, 20, through a supply corridor she'd never used. Her phone. In her hand, already locked, the photos uploaded automatically to the cloud account she'd set up specifically for this purpose at 10 o'clock that morning, when she'd started to understand where this was going. She held the phone up so he could see that she understood these calculations too. "The photos are already uploaded," she said. "Removing the phone doesn't remove the record." Harwick's expression did not change very much, which was its own kind of information. Men who were only afraid of being caught tended to react. Men who were deciding what to do next tended to be still. "You don't understand what you've involved yourself in," he said. "I understand that a 14-week-old child has been losing weight for 11 days because someone altered his nutritional formula," she said. "I understand whose child that is. And I understand that whoever arranged for you to be on staff here is going to need to explain to that man how his son ended up in a pharmacy technician's secondary log." Harwick was quiet. "There are 2 men on the 7th floor," Wren said, "who I suspect are going to be very interested in what I've found, and I've already sent a text." She watched his face. So the question of what happens next in this room is really not as complicated as you're making it. She walked to the door. He let her go. She found out later. Pieced it together from fragments of conversations she was not supposed to hear, from a brief exchange with one of the quieter members of Stellan's security team, from the careful not-quite answers Stellan himself gave when she asked direct questions, that Jerome Harwick had been placed at Harrington by a man named Gideon Voss, who had been Stellan's second-in-command for 6 years, and who had identified Arlo's existence as a threat to his own succession position approximately 10 minutes after receiving confirmation that Stellan's wife had not survived the accident on Route 1. She also found out that the photographs she had uploaded became the basis for a chain of evidence that led to Harwick's arrest, Voss's removal from his position, and a series of subsequent events that she was told about only in the most general terms. What she knew with certainty was this. At Arlo's next weight check 36 hours after the bag swap, he had gained 1.5 ounces. It was not a dramatic number. On a chart it was a small movement, a line that bent slightly upward. But she had been watching this chart for nearly 2 weeks, and she understood what it meant the way you understand something after you've been waiting for it with your whole chest. She wrote it in the nursing notes. Gained 1.5s, 36 hours post-formula revision. Tolerating feeds well, vitals stable. She did not write. I stayed up for 2 nights, straight reconstructing a TPN deviation log and photographed 4 pages of handwritten evidence in an empty pharmacy lab at 9:45 while the man responsible was coming through the door. She did not write. I was terrified every single moment, and I did it anyway. The notes were for the record. The rest was hers. On the morning she was discharged from her temporary assignment on 7, which had been extended, without official explanation, for nearly 3 weeks after the standard 4-day rotation, Wren came to do her final check on Arlo. He had gained 14 ounces from his lowest recorded weight. He was still small, still premature in the specific ways that 14-week-old bodies are, still requiring more than he would have needed with an additional 8 weeks of gestation. But his color was good, his feeding tolerance was good. He had the particular unearned confidence of very young humans everywhere, the absolute biological certainty that he was going to keep going. Stellan was in the chair. She'd become accustomed to this, the amber lamp, the chair, the particular quality of his stillness in that room. She'd had 12 conversations with him over the past 3 weeks that ranged from 3 minutes to 1 hour and 45 minutes, and covered a territory she couldn't quite map. Clinical updates, some of which led into territory that was not clinical. Questions he asked her about nursing, and about what she'd studied before nursing, and about a specific comment she'd made about evidence documentation that seemed to have caught his attention more than she'd expected. She had learned that he was precise in a way that wasn't common, that he listened the way people listen when they're actually interested in what the other person is saying, rather than in what they're going to say next. That he had been sitting in that chair for 3 weeks, not because he didn't trust the medical staff, though she suspected he didn't trust most of them, but because he had decided, somewhere in the first 12 days of his son's life, that presence was the only thing he could control. She understood that. "He's doing well," she said. "The 14-day weight trajectory is positive. Dr. Okafor is going to recommend transitioning to step-down monitoring at the end of the week." Stellan nodded, looking at Arlo. "You're leaving today," he said. "Reassign back to 6. She paused. "Better ratio down there. They need the coverage." He was quiet for a moment, then, "What you did?" She waited. "I've had a great many people work for me," he said. "People I pay specifically to identify threats and act on them quickly. People with resources I don't give to anyone else." He looked at her then, the direct, assessing look she'd gotten used to, that she'd stopped finding unsettling and had started finding simply honest. "None of them saw what you saw in that chart." "I read every note in sequence," she said. "Most people read only their section. That's not the only difference." She didn't answer that. She checked Arlo's monitors, noted the readings, initialed the log. "If you ever need anything, Stellan said. It was not the beginning of a promise and not the end of one. It was something in between, precise like him, specific in its openness. She looked at him, the amber light, the chair that had become a vigil, the man who had sat in it for 22 days and never once stopped looking at his son. "Take him home healthy," she said. "That's what I need." She picked up her chart and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame, not turning back. Not because she didn't want to, but because some moments were better held exactly as they were. Then she went back to 6, where the elevator buttons were scuffed, and the coffee was always cold, and 3 other babies were waiting for someone to read their charts all the way through.